The fire had burned low in the stone hearth, casting long shadows across the cabin walls, when Samuel Briggs finally lay back on his bed, pretending to sleep. Outside, the wind howled down from the Colorado peaks, rattling the shutters like a warning. The mountain nights were cruel this time of year, sharp enough to cut through even the thickest wool. But Samuel wasn't listening to the storm. His eyes, half closed under the brim of his hat, were fixed on the woman moving quietly near the kitchen table. Her name was Clara. She'd arrived 2 months ago, heavy with child, desperate for work after her husband's death on a cattle drive. He'd taken her in out of pity, or that's what he told himself. But pity had long turned into something else, something he didn't dare name. Samuel owned half the land between Bitter Ridge and the valley below. The locals called him the Mountain Man, with gold under his floorboards, though he'd earned every cent with his own hands. His cabin was big enough for 10, yet for years it had echoed with nothing but the creak of timber and the wind's lonely cry. Then Clara came, and the silence broke. She worked from dawn till dark despite the weight of her belly, sweeping floors, baking bread, patching clothes. She never complained, never asked for favors. And that's what unsettled Samuel most. He'd grown used to people wanting something from him. But not her. Not once had she looked at him like a man with money. Tonight, though, he meant to find out who she really was. He had pretended to fall asleep early after supper, leaving a pouch of gold coins on the table beside his journal, just within reach of temptation. He wanted to see if she'd take it, if all her quiet goodness was just another mask like the rest of them wore. From beneath his hat brim, he watched her. Clara stood at the table, her hands trembling slightly as she wiped the surface clean. The lamplight turned her loose brown hair to bronze and made the thin fabric of her dress glow softly against her rounded stomach. For a long moment, she simply stared at the pouch of gold. Samuel's heart thudded in his chest. Any second now, he thought, but instead, she reached for his journal. He stiffened, fighting the urge to move. That leather-bound book held his most private thoughts, memories of his dead wife, letters he'd written but never sent, words he'd never dared speak aloud. Clara opened it carefully, her fingers brushing over the pages as though they were holy. Then, to his shock, she whispered softly, "She must have been a good woman, Mr. Briggs. You still write about her like she's sitting right here." Samuel's breath caught. Clara's voice was so low he barely heard her. She turned the pages slowly, tears glinting in her eyes when she reached the sketches, rough drawings he'd made of his late wife years ago. "You must have loved her something fierce," she murmured. "If I ever get to heaven, I'll tell her she's still loved down here." She closed the journal gently, placed it exactly where it had been, and looked toward the bed where he lay pretending to sleep. Her expression softened. "You don't fool me, Mr. Briggs," she said quietly. "You act hard as granite, but your heart's still beating under all that cold." Quote. Then she did something that froze him completely. She knelt beside the bed, folding her hands over her swollen belly, and began to pray, not for herself, not even for the child she carried, but for him. "Lord," she whispered, "this man's been alone too long. I see it in his eyes every time he looks out that window. He thinks no one notices, but I do. Please, give him peace. He deserves it more than he knows." The fire popped in the silence that followed. Samuel's throat tightened until it hurt to breathe. He had wanted to catch her stealing, to prove his mistrust right. Instead, she had prayed for him. When Clara finally rose, she walked to the window, looking out into the dark where snowflakes drifted like ghosts. Her hand rested protectively on her stomach. "We'll be safe here, little one," she whispered. "Even if he never says it, I know he'd never turn us away." Samuel lay frozen, guilt pressing down on him heavier than any mountain snow. He had built his life on mistrust, on the belief that every soul had a price. But what price could you place on kindness like that? As her lamp flickered out and silence reclaimed the cabin, Samuel turned his face toward the wall, unable to sleep. For the first time in years, he felt something shift inside him, something he thought had died with his wife. Outside, the storm raged, but within those four walls, a different kind of storm had begun, the kind that could tear down the coldest heart if given the chance. The morning sun broke through the mountain mist, spilling gold across the frozen valley. Samuel Briggs sat at the long pine table, hands wrapped around a mug of black coffee gone cold. He hadn't slept a wink. Every word Clara whispered in her prayer still echoed in his mind. She moved quietly about the kitchen, humming a soft tune as she stirred a pot of oatmeal on the stove. The scent of cinnamon filled the cabin, warm and comforting. She looked as if nothing had happened the night before, as if she hadn't unknowingly laid his heart bare with a few gentle words. "Morning, Mr. Briggs," she said, turning with a faint smile. Her eyes were tired but kind. "You were up early." He nodded, his voice rough. "Couldn't sleep. Too much on my mind." Clara poured him a bowl and slid it across the table. "Thinking doesn't do much good on an empty stomach." He almost smiled at that. Almost. As she turned away, he studied her closely. The way she moved slower now, one hand resting on her belly every few minutes. She was near the end of her term, maybe a month left. He wondered if she had anyone waiting for her, any family at all. But he already knew the answer. She'd told him once, in a quiet voice, that her people were gone. The plains fever took her parents. Her husband had died working another man's cattle. She had no one. After breakfast, Samuel put on his coat and stepped outside. The cold hit him like a hammer. His land stretched for miles, a frozen kingdom of pine and snow. He'd built everything with his own hands, but now the silence felt heavier than ever. He thought about the pouch of gold he'd left out the night before, still untouched. The woman inside that cabin was nothing like the kind he'd known before. He spent the morning chopping wood just to clear his head, the steady rhythm of the axe hitting the block a dull comfort. But even out there, he couldn't shake the image of Clara kneeling beside his bed, praying for him. He cursed himself for doubting her. When he returned near midday, the smell of fresh bread met him at the door. Clara was standing by the counter, dusted in flour, her sleeves rolled up to her elbows. Her face was pale, though, and sweat dotted her forehead despite the chill in the cabin. "You all right?" he asked, stepping closer. She nodded too quickly. "Just tired. The baby's been restless." "You should rest, not bake bread for me," he said gruffly. Clara gave him a small, weary smile. "Keeps my mind busy. Besides, works better than worrying." But not 10 minutes later, the bowl slipped from her hands and shattered on the floor. Samuel caught her before she hit the ground. Her body trembled in his arms. "Clara?" he said sharply. She gasped, clutching her belly. "It's too early," she whispered. "It's not time yet." Panic clawed at his chest. He'd helped deliver calves, but never a child. "Hold on," he said. "I'll get help." She grabbed his arm, shaking her head. "Nearest town's 15 miles away. You won't make it back in time." The color drained from his face. He helped her to the bed, his hands unsteady. "Tell me what to do," he said. Through pain and shallow breaths, she guided him as best she could. The hours that followed felt endless. The cabin filled with the sound of wind howling through the cracks and Clara's muffled cries. Sweat ran down Samuel's back as he did everything she told him, his heart pounding with fear and something deeper, something that felt like helpless love. When the first cry of the baby filled the air, Samuel's knees nearly gave out. A tiny girl, red-faced and fierce, squirmed in his hands. Clara's head fell back against the pillow, her breathing shallow but steady. "She's strong," Clara whispered weakly, "just like her father was." Samuel's chest tightened. He wrapped the infant in a clean cloth and placed her in Clara's arms. "You did good," he said softly. "Real good." Quote. Clara smiled faintly, her eyes fluttering shut. "Thank you, Mr. Briggs." For the next few days, Samuel rarely left the cabin. He cooked, tended the fire, and watched over Clara and the baby. He'd never seen such tenderness as when Clara held her little girl, whispering lullabies in a voice barely above the wind. One evening as the fire crackled, Clara looked up at him. "You're a good man, Mr. Briggs. Don't let the world tell you otherwise." He swallowed hard. "I ain't done much good in my life." "You took in a stranger with nowhere to go," she said softly. "That's something." Samuel turned away, pretending to check the firewood. He didn't want her to see the emotion burning in his eyes. But before the night ended, he made himself a silent promise that as long as breath stayed in his lungs, neither Clara nor that child would ever go cold or hungry again. Outside, the snow kept falling. Inside, for the first time in years, Samuel Briggs felt like the walls of that lonely mountain cabin finally had a reason to hold warmth again. Spring came slowly to the mountains, melting away the heavy snows that had buried Samuel's land for months. Patches of green pushed through the thawing earth, and the river that ran behind the cabin roared again with life. Inside, Clara sat by the window with her baby girl cradled in her arms, humming a gentle tune. Samuel watched from the doorway, his heart stirring in a way he hadn't thought possible anymore. He'd spent the last few months making sure they had everything they needed, cutting extra firewood, trading pelts in town for fabric and sugar, even building a new crib from pine. The cabin, once filled with silence, now carried laughter and the soft coos of a child. But with every passing day, Samuel's guilt grew heavier. He still hadn't told Clara about the night he pretended to sleep, the night he tested her. It gnawed at him. He owed her the truth, even if it cost him the little piece they'd found. That evening, as the baby drifted to sleep, Samuel poured 2 cups of coffee and sat across from Clara at the table. The lamplight flickered over her tired but gentle face. "Clara," he began, his voice low, "there's something I need to tell you." She looked up, sensing the weight in his tone. "What is it?" Quote, he rubbed a hand over his beard, searching for words. "That night, back in the winter, the night before you gave birth, I wasn't asleep." Clara's brows knit together slightly. "You mean when I prayed?" He nodded. "I left that gold on the table on purpose. I wanted to see if you'd take it. I wanted to test you." Her eyes widened, then softened as understanding dawned. He went on, his voice heavy with shame. "I've spent so long thinking everyone had a price. I guess I didn't believe anyone could be good without wanting something in return. I was wrong. You showed me that." Clara was silent for a moment. Then she reached across the table and placed her hand over his rough one. "You've lived a hard life, Mr. Briggs. A man doesn't learn trust in a world that keeps taking from him. But you didn't have to test me. You've already done more for me and my child than anyone ever has." He swallowed, his chest tightening. "You still don't hate me for it?" Quote. Clara shook her head gently. "You were searching for truth. Sometimes people test others because they're afraid of being hurt again." Her words hit him deep. He turned his eyes away, blinking hard. "You prayed for me," he said quietly, "even when I didn't deserve it." "I prayed," she said, "because I saw a man trying to remember what kindness feels like." The cabin went quiet, except for the fire crackling in the hearth. Samuel looked up, his blue eyes meeting hers. "You could leave now if you wanted," he said. "You've got a child to think about. You deserve better than a broken man like me." Clara smiled softly. "Where would I go? This place feels more like home than anywhere I've ever known. You gave us safety when the world had none to offer. You might not see it, but that's the kind of man a child deserves to grow up around." Samuel felt something break inside him, a wall that had stood too long. He reached out and touched the baby's tiny hand where she slept in her cradle. "Then stay," he said, his voice trembling just enough to show the truth behind it. "Stay, and let me take care of you both. Not because I owe it, but because I want to." Clara's eyes glistened. "Are you sure?" Quote. He nodded. "I've been alone long enough to know I don't want to die that way. And this house, it was never meant to be empty." Tears filled her eyes as she stood and stepped close to him. For the first time, she let herself rest against his chest. His arms came around her carefully, protectively. For a long while, they just stood there, 2 broken souls finding warmth in each other's quiet strength. Weeks passed, and the valley bloomed in full. Samuel built a fence around a small garden where Clara could grow herbs and vegetables. He built a cradle swing beneath the cottonwood tree for the baby, who now giggled at the sound of her mother's voice and the deep rumble of Samuel's laughter. One afternoon, a passing trader stopped by the cabin and smiled at the sight of them all on the porch. Clara sewing, the baby asleep in her lap, and Samuel carving wood beside them. "Didn't think I'd ever see the old mountain man tamed?" the trader teased. Samuel just smiled, glancing toward Clara. "Ain't tamed," he said, "just finally found what's worth staying for." That night, as the firelight danced across the walls, Clara laid the baby down and whispered a prayer once more. This time not for loneliness or safety, but for gratitude. Samuel listened from the doorway, the same spot where months ago he'd tested her heart. Now he bowed his head and whispered a prayer of his own. "Thank you," he said quietly, his voice breaking with emotion. "For sendin' her here, for teachin' me to live again." Outside, the mountain wind blew gentle through the pines, carrying with it the sound of new life. Inside, love had found its home, soft, steady, and unspoken, just like the woman who'd brought it there.